Hello everyone, this is Jen and I make useful English Lit study videos on Shakespeare, poetry, fiction, literary devices and more to help you get top grades in the subject. So in today's video, we are exploring what is commonly referred to as the golden age of English literature, which is the Renaissance era. Shakespeare, Marlowe, John Donne, Ben Jonson, you name it. This period roughly spanned the 1550s to the 1650s, from the start of Elizabeth I's reign in 1558 through James' accession in 1603, and finally to the execution of Charles I in 1649. During these 100 years, England saw huge changes resulting from the struggle between Protestant and Catholic forces, which affected pretty much every rank in social and political life. As a result, literary production would often be bound up with royal interests and religious considerations. And depending on whether Protestant or Catholic forces were dominant at a given point in time, the writing of poetry and drama would flourish or wither. For instance, devotional lyrics were highly encouraged by the Protestant Church because they aligned with the spirit of direct mediation between the individual and God. But the Puritans banned all plays and theatres in 1642, when theatres were closed for almost 2 decades until the restoration of Charles II in 1660. So for most of Elizabeth I and James I's reign, Protestant factions gained much of the upper hand. And it wasn't until the start of the Stuart period, when Charles I succeeded the throne, that anti-Catholic policies relaxed, largely because he was sympathetic to Catholic causes and he was married to a Catholic French princess. This, as expected, angered the Puritans and Calvinists and would eventually lead to the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. Now, the bigger point to all of this is that so much great literature came out of the Renaissance, not necessarily because the intellectual climate back then encouraged any sort of free thinking and creative expression. Instead, it was the external factors that culminated to create an environment which just so happened to encourage people to write a lot. From monarchical preferences, with James I being an avid writer himself, to commercial circumstances, with playgoing being such a cheap pastime, to religious influences, metaphysical poetry often being written by priests and clerics, to the social structure, when writers tended to show their gratitude to their patrons by writing dedicatory poems. But with so many external considerations at stake, writers' fates were heavily affected by their political savviness and social ties. Writing was a highly regulated affair, and censorship, not to mention self-censorship, was rife. Shakespeare's acting company was called the King's Men after James I's ascension to the throne in 1603. And because James was notoriously Wicca-phobic, the demonic portrayal of the three sisters in Macbeth was almost certainly a product of calculated shrewdness on the bard's part. On the other hand, when it became clear that Thomas Middleton's satirical play A Game at Chess criticised James's handling of Anglo-Spanish relations, the play was promptly shut down after just 9 days. In any case, all publications had to be reviewed by press licenses and approved by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London, while all plays had to pass through the discerning eye of the Master of the Rebels, who was the government official in charge of stage censorship. Clearly, being an author back in Renaissance England wasn't quite a walk in the park. In the rest of this video, I'll be explaining what I think are 3 of the most important concepts related to Renaissance literature. This is, of course, not an exhaustive list, but if you want a good entry point into understanding the background of early modern literature, this is going to be incredibly helpful for your studies. So let's dive straight in. From the highest to the lowest social ranks, drama was an important aspect of Renaissance English life. To the monarchs, theatrical productions like court masques provided the pomp and circumstance of spectacle necessary to consolidate the majesty of royal rule. To the commoners, playgoing was an affordable pastime, and playhouses were a place for people to congregate and enjoy themselves. Audiences and actors would often be so close to each other that many of what we would today consider to be these meta-theatrical references were very much taken for granted, as the line between drama and life was visibly porous. As Jacques says in As You Like It, all the world's a stage and we are merely players. In many ways, the theatre was a social gelling agent which held communities together. All the while, acting, no pun intended, as this de facto PR machine for the English court. This is especially apparent after James I's ascension to the throne, after which Shakespeare's playing company was renamed to the King's Men from Lord Chamberlain's Men and placed under James' patronage. Only men were allowed to be professional actors, with female parts often being taken up by young boys from grammar and choral schools. Characters were usually written with a specific actor in mind. For instance, Richard Burbage was particularly skilled at playing noble tragic characters like Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, etc. And Shakespeare would often write the lines of these characters with Burbage's style and mannerisms in mind. Now, what Shakespeare and other dramatists like Marlowe, Kidd, Middleton, etc. would also have had in mind was the political and religious sensitivity of their plays. While Shakespeare rarely crossed red lines after James came into power, for obvious reasons, he did get on Elizabeth I's nerves with the deposition scene in Richard II, which had to be removed at the command of the Queen's censors. Other popular dramatists likewise fell foul of censorship requirements at different points in their career. For example, Thomas Middleton's anti-Spanish political satire A Game at Chess was banned after running for just 9 days, while Ben Jonson and George Chapman were imprisoned for angering James with their anti-Scottish digs in their co-authored play Eastward Ho! Another important point to note is that drama was always written to be performed, not published. This is why there are very few original extant copies of play scripts, because they were usually scribbled on sheets of paper for rehearsal purposes, and actors would often improvise lines right on the spot, in effect also contributing to the authorship of the plays. So as you can see, Renaissance playwriting was a highly fluid, collaborative and dynamic process, and not at all aligned with the post-romantic image of the single author sitting alone in the dark, poring away meticulously over words and lines. In any case, any publication of texts had to be approved by the Stationers' Company, which was the publishing guild that regulated the dissemination of texts. And most plays were printed as cheap foldable quartos. It wasn't until later, and in Shakespeare's case, after his death, that plays gained in status for folio publication, as folios were these large leather-bound books usually reserved for biblical or prestigious works. And Shakespeare's first folio, published in 1623, is a posthumous work compiled by the dramatist's friends from his playing company, who were Henry Condell and John Hemming. But this was an expensive collector's item, and not at all the version of plays that most of the Renaissance playgoing public had access to. By the way guys, I'd massively appreciate it if you could hit the thumbs up button below, subscribe to my channel and switch on that bell notification if you find this video helpful so far. This would really help me carry on making these useful English Lit study videos so that you can get top grades in the subject and we can inspire more people to enjoy the study of literature. After Gutenberg had invented the printing press in the mid-15th century, this technology was swiftly introduced to England by William Caxton, with the first ever published work in English being Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. This was revolutionary for literary production and public literacy, but mass publication of written works didn't really take off for quite some time, and it certainly wasn't prevalent in the Renaissance period. While drama was primarily communicated to the public through the stage, remember, play scripts were often just these scraps of paper or at best cheap quarto foldables, poems were largely circulated in manuscript form within coterie private circles. This is because most poetry back then was often penned as dedicatory notes from writers to patrons, or for the purpose of solitary meditation or entertainment, as in the case of John Donne's Holy Sonnets. Scribing out verse in manuscript form was also considered to be an elite activity, something that only the upper class and the learned could do. This snobbery is reflected in John Donne's poem to Dr. Andrews, in which he gushes over the supremacy of what is writ by hand over what printing presses yield. Apart from being a social status marker, there was a practical benefit to coterie circulation of manuscripts. Avoiding publication also meant avoiding the scrutinizing eyes of censors, and this in turn allowed for freer, more explicit expression and more daring ideas to be explored in poetry. For example, the racy imagery and sexual suggestiveness of Donne's poem The Flea would probably not have been approved by press licenses, but perhaps the constant fear of being caught out for writing bannable content was some sort of blessing in disguise, because it probably inspired writers like the metaphysical poets to be wildly creative with their writing styles so as to hide sensitive content and metaphorical conceit. And conceit is a technique which compares two starkly different things to convey a thematic idea. For instance, the first stanza to The Flea ostensibly describes the speaker's frustration over being bitten by this insect, but upon closer reading, we see that it's a cheeky plea for the addressee to have sex with him. Despite the widespread practice of manuscript circulation, there were a couple of printed poetry volumes that eventually legitimized the status of verse as being good enough for publication. Perhaps the landmark event of this was Richard Tottle's 1557 publication of Song and Sonnets, otherwise known as Tottle's Miscellany, which was the first ever printed English poetry anthology. Containing 271 poems, some of which were Petrarchan sonnets, Tottle's Miscellany was a commercial success and proof that there was indeed a potential market for printed literature. Towards the end of the 16th century, Sir Philip Sidney's sonnet sequence Astrophel and Stella was published posthumously as a single author volume, which was followed by Ben Jonson's lavish and somewhat self-aggrandizing publication of his poetical and dramatic works in folio format in 1616. And with the subsequent publication of Shakespeare's first folio in 1623 and John Donne's poem 10 years later, the road to a wider public readership was paved for poetry and to some extent for plays as well. Nowadays, most of us would expect anyone considered to be a great author to also be a fountain of original creative ideas. But this expectation is actually a fairly modern construct, having gained currency only after the Romantic era, when the concept of the original genius took root as a marker of artistic and literary brilliance. But back in the Renaissance, emulation, not originality, was the name of the game. Grammar schools adopted the humanist approach to education, which sought to revive Greek and Latin classical texts for their wisdom and stylistic superiority. People like Shakespeare would have studied more Greek and Latin than most classics undergraduates today, so it should probably come as no surprise that much of his and other Renaissance writing were heavily influenced by past source texts. While Homer's Iliad and Odyssey provided some of the main inspiration for many Renaissance epics and love poetry, perhaps it was Francesco Petrarch, the 14th century Italian poet, who left the most lasting legacy in English prosody with the gradual popularity of the Petrarchan sonnet form and sequence among English Renaissance poets. Unsurprisingly, the Bible was another major source text, especially after the publication of the authorized King James Bible in 1611. For example, George Herbert, who was both a metaphysical poet and an Anglican priest, alludes to the Psalms in his concrete poem, The Altar, as you can see from the first line here. Now, when it comes to drama, a variety of medieval morality plays, Senecan tragedies, Italian verse and comedies also made their presence felt in much of Elizabethan and Jacobean drama. Shakespeare alone offers an endless sampler of classical and continental source texts. Hamlet is a clear inheritor of the Senecan tragedy format. Macbeth is an episode adapted from the English historian Raphael Holinshed's Histories. Othello is based on a tale written by the Italian novelist Cinthio, and Romeo and Juliet carry strong echoes of the tragic romance between Pyramus and Thisbe in Ovid's Metamorphoses. And of course, it wasn't just Shakespeare. For instance, Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faust, which is arguably one of the most important Renaissance works on par with some of Shakespeare's best plays, is based largely on the German legend about Johann Faust, who was a scholar whose unmet intellectual ambitions drove him to make a pact with the devil, whereby he exchanges his soul for all the knowledge in the world. So the point to all of this emulation business is that when studying Renaissance literature, we'll need to reorient our understanding of what creativity means. Because creativity back then manifested not so much in original thought or new plot lines, but in the writer's resourceful appropriation and stylistic refinement of existing texts. And that's it for this video, guys. We've really just covered the tip of the iceberg. So if you're interested in a more in-depth understanding of Renaissance context, check out the links in the description box below for some other recommended reading. Otherwise, I hope this has been helpful as important background knowledge for your study of Renaissance literature. And if you enjoyed this, please do hit the thumbs up button below so that you can help me spread my videos to more like-minded, high-achieving, top-grade literature students like yourself. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already so that you don't miss out on any of my weekly lit study videos going forward. And of course, so that you can support my work so that I can continue making these useful lit English study videos to help you get top grades in the subject. And I'll see you in the next video.